Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Silent Podcast. Today, we'll be exploring ways by which businesses can use and adopt privacy enhancing technologies to not only help address challenges that they may be facing from a pure privacy perspective, but what are the opportunities that also exist from a monetization perspective. And we will be covering a number of topics, specifically talking about what is the opportunity within this space, what are businesses doing to address this. We'll be taking a few sectoral dives. My name is Anubhav, and I'm extremely excited to host this. And I have two distinguished gentlemen with me. Firstly, introducing Dr. J. Prakash. He's the co-founder and CEO of Silence Laboratories, a deep tech cybersecurity startup headquartered in Singapore that is focusing on building highly scalable cryptographic infrastructures for privacy-preserving computation, authorization, and collaboration. Dr. J holds a PhD in computer science, where he did research on design of multi-factor and multi-model authentication algorithms, and also discovered several vulnerabilities in contemporary 2FA solutions. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you, Anubhav.
Also on this panel is another very distinguished gentleman, and perhaps a familiar face here in Singapore. Wanted to introduce Tony Quek. He's the Cheng Sang Man Chair Professor with the Singapore University of Technology and Design. He's leading the Wireless Network and Decision System Group. He's also the Director of Future Communication R&D Program and the Deputy Director of SUTD ZJU IDEA. At MIT, he earned the PhD in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. He's a fellow of IEEE. Welcome, Tony. I'm extremely excited to have both of you on this panel. So today, if you really look at privacy-enhancing technologies, this is becoming the center of so many discussions. I have some stats over here which are extremely revealing. Gartner predicts that by 2025, 60% of larger organizations will at least be using one pet or privacy-based technology within their ecosystem, specifically for analytics or business intelligence and so many other use cases. This market is right now valued at close to $2.5 billion US, but it is expected to 10x itself in the next 8 years. So it's growing extremely fast, extremely rapidly across different markets. And from a privacy and regulation perspective, we're seeing that 80% of countries today have or are discussing some sort of privacy legislation, and 71% of all countries across the world actually have a legislation that is in place. So let me start with you, Jay, first. I'm curious to know, there's some exciting work that we were talking about that you're doing at Silence Laboratories. Perhaps shed some more light in terms of what you're doing at the company and how you're addressing and looking at solving problems within this space.
Yeah, sure. Definitely very promising stats to what we will see growing up in market. All these stats are, I believe, pushed by three variables: compliance, technology, and business interest. In terms of compliance, we have been seeing very increasing interest in proper handling of data, and very good segregation is coming up in terms of who is the owner of data and who has the custodianship of data. And that sets up a premise for what tech will be doing. And we have been seeing lots of technical innovations in past decade, largely in last 5 years, in different domains of PETs. Many techs like FHE or MBC, which were not scalable even 5 years ago, they are now much more efficient and scalable. That's happening. And there's a good interest from business to monetize their data. And Silence is one of those leading innovation company, which is working on technical innovations in terms of privacy enhancing technologies, particularly in privacy preserving computation. So we are investing lots of time on multiple avenues: research, technical building, and as well as a lots of thing on design as well. One thing which we are championing now is consent and compute binding. We are introducing concepts and trying to systemize the whole consent paradigm, and then we can solve the larger data problems, which we will talk much more probably as we go ahead in this podcast.
That's very interesting. And I think, and one of my main objectives of getting both of you was to get a technology perspective and also get an industry perspective. So while Jay, you've talked about the opportunity that exists in this space. Tony, I'm very curious to know from you. You have an illustrious career behind you, specifically within the telco sector, understanding the dynamics within that industry. Curious to know from your perspective, how are you seeing this space evolving?
There's a lot of attention into privacy in terms of technology, protection, trust. I think there's two aspects. As you have mentioned, regulation. There's a lot of regulations in many countries, particularly Singapore. They're forcing enterprise organizations to really look at that. But that's a positive side. But on the flip side, it makes enterprise to be more conservative. And they don't realize the potential of PET, which is privacy enhancing technologies, which has a huge potential to monetize data. I think the way forward is awareness, industry, especially in telco and other sector, to be aware that you actually can protect data and yet monetize data.
And just to follow up on that, do you see there to be a disproportionately higher effort needed on the awareness side? I'm curious to know, are you talking about mentioning awareness only on just privacy in general, or also on the monetization piece?
I guess awareness in privacy, we do have sort of the base awareness. Everybody talk about privacy, but monetization is one part that is missing piece. In a sense, how do you can protect privacy of the data, yet you can monetize? I think this is something that needs more awareness and introduce PET technologies to the community in large.
Thank you for both for sharing this. I would now like to take a deep dive, specifically within the telco sector, and understand how organizations can adopt PET within their overall ecosystem. So, really, when we think of telcos, Tony, from your experience, today telcos are sitting on potentially their highest level of data. They are part of our ecosystem. Our telcos are, have access to not only our basic requirements like our data in terms of our phone numbers, but they have access to obviously demographic, psychographic, income level, etc. And I'm sure that they sit on a plethora of data right now at their end. Given that data monetization continues to be a high priority for telco, so what in your experience is stopping these telcos from just leveraging their data more aggressively and just essentially earning more money?
I guess the fundamental problem is in order to data monetize, I guess this sector is looking at, I need to move my data to different sectors or different companies in order to process their data, to monetize the data. So data movement becomes sort of a bottleneck. In order to move data, there's a lot of regulatory approvals. There's a lot of stringent constraints, restrictions, and that a lot of times limited that. And companies at telcos becomes very risk averse, especially when you move data with privacy concerns. I think that is the main bottleneck. If there's technology that allows us not to move data and yet we can monetize, and then this will be crucial to them to monetize this data.
I'm also curious to know that how you're seeing from, just from a technology capability perspective within telcos, are they working with external partners, leveraging some of the technologies that actually exist out there, with businesses that are essentially focused on that? Are telcos actually, in your experience, working with industries or companies externally to help address this problem?
This is also another change that telco needs to adapt in all this new industry. There's a skill gap, definitely. You're right, telcos a lot of time is based on subscription base. The capability there needs to build up in order to understand these evolving new technologies in PET. The skills gap is something that's missing, which internally they need to be built to work with the right partners in order to leverage on these new technologies for data monetization.
Understood. So, Jay, clearly what Tony has mentioned, a key challenge is data movement, right? How are you addressing the simple problem that telcos, like a lot of other sectors, perhaps fintech sectors, and maybe you can share some examples from your experience, wherever data is sensitive and companies are not okay with data movement, how do you solve for that problem?
Yeah, that is correct. As Tony pointed and you shared, this problem comes very evidently in all our communications, whether telecom, financial sector, and healthcare. We have to understand why this is a problem. The problem lies in the very context that if you have to move data, you need to sanitize it and anonymize it. And even then, there are multiple orders of risk, which can expose lots of information about the users. So, as a company, our very ethos is that let's not move data, let's adopt technologies wherein you can get exactly same output without moving data. So, the ethos is let's move inference around, let's move compute around. And if you can get that correct, then these companies will be motivated to partner and do more collaboration and monetization. So, what we do is we use PET, particularly multi-party computation, wherein you can compute any function between two or more parties without actually moving data to a central trusted party. You can perform any computation. You can perform multiple risk scoring analysis, like we have been partnering with multiple credit scoring companies, or you can perform comparisons and checks between different data sets and many more, which perfect guarantee that no other party has exposure to the other party's data. Or in a very simple format, you can consider this tech as computing on encrypted data. If you can compute on encrypted data, you can guarantee everything to a compliance or a business logic, which is expected. That's what we are doing at Silence.
So, Jay, can you explain in detail, purely from a user perspective, from a company's perspective, what is MPC? How does it work?
Right. So MPC is multi-party computation. It has been there in academia for more than a decade or more than that. Essentially, it helps you. Let's say you have three. We all have D1, D2, and D3. And our goal is to compute average of D1, D2, and D3 and send to someone who is requesting for that. In a traditional way, we will move this D1, D2, and D3 to one party whom we trust. They can compute this. But if you want to adopt MPC, what we do is it's a chatty protocol which will encrypt some part of your data and send to me. I will do some computation, send to Tony, and then the Tony will return. It's an interactive chatty protocol. But at the end, each one of us or anyone will get the final output, which is average of D1, D2, and D3. And we will end up with perfect security and privacy guarantees. So fundamentally, it's just a way to compute without exposing data in one place and avoiding any single point of failure.
That's wonderful. When you're talking about MPC, outside of telcos, I would love to know a couple of examples, the kind of problems that you're solving right now using MPC.
Right. So dominantly, we are seeing traction from two particular cases. One is from finance and one is from healthcare. In finance, the traditional credit scoring, we believe, is broken because you have to trust parties. That's one aspect. And another aspect is you can't get more data if you are just trusting a party. We have seen in multiple case studies that if you can get multiple sources of data from alternative sources of data, like from telecom plus finance plus bills of electricity or water, you can create much more better and reliable score. So that is one aspect which we are currently working on with lots of partners. We are solving cases where banks want to collaborate and do checks either for AML or for sanctionless monitoring and many more. They can use our tech, and that's something which we are doing as well. In healthcare, you can create much more better clinical trial targets if healthcare and ERPs and hospitals can collaborate.
Interesting. I want to just go back to Tony, something which you mentioned earlier in terms of building tech capabilities within the companies, specifically within telcos. What, in your view, can telcos do more of when it comes to adopting these kind of technologies within their ecosystem? Because clearly, the technology adds a strong value, a strong commercial value, which is also extremely important. And while it's been there for a long time, it's obviously at a stage where it's really gaining rapid traction. In your opinion, what are some of the changes that you would wish for or you would strongly advise, which would be relevant for telcos to potentially evaluate such technologies within their ecosystem?
I guess it's the risk mindset, and also to understand that the potential of pet technologies. So there's one part, awareness at the top management level of this changing technology. There's another part which is internally restructuring that to look at data, to have a chief data scientist, to have a chief data security scientist, that they need to talk to each other. It's not a data scientist. You just talk to enterprise type of data companies, security talk to security companies, because you do to monetize, they come together, and the financial officer needs to talk to both three, which is a very real new architecture. So internally, you need to change in the way you structure. Secondly, there's a lot of new implementation of the structure and the ecosystem you want to work with, where a lot of tech technologies are companies that are new, companies in the front line, and to be open up to them to explore new services. I think this is what needs to be changed.
I'd love to get a perspective from both of you, starting with you, Tony. Where do you think in a telco should this conversation start? When I say where, as in which function?
That's a very interesting question. I think structurally, it always have to be on the top. The top, at least at the CEO level, the chairman, as I mentioned, the CTO level, needs to look at that because it's about data monetization. So because that allows them to improve the revenue. We know that telco currently face a lot of issue because of power. We know the cost of power is increasing. That actually pushes down their revenue. So they need to really look at new form of revenue, which is easier because they have huge amount of data, as you mentioned. Data is already there. I don't need to do more. Then with that data, how do you generate more revenue? I think that should be the first thing that on the top level have to have a plan strategy, then involving down the step. How do you change the whole structure and ecosystem?
Jay?
Yeah, true. Like Tony is saying, it's all about data and monetization. What we feel, which have been working and which we will work, is trying to convince these partners from both top, bottom, and bottom to up. Bottom, it will start from data innovation officers, or these companies have head of monetization, and then they will become our champion to convince to their chief revenue officer or to CEOs and CTOs. But the best bet for now, we feel, is these monetization chiefs within Telcos whom should be convinced.
That's extremely interesting. So for me, that's really eye-opening, where I would have imagined intuitively to think that we probably talk about the security officers, the CISOs or the CSOs, etc. But I find it fascinating how both of you, one from a technology perspective, one from the industry perspective, kind of unanimous in saying that it's becoming more and more a revenue discussion. And while privacy and preventive is extremely important, but just the opportunity in terms of telcos embracing this more actively at their end makes it extremely interesting. So clearly, revenue is the common theme that is coming through over here. I'm going to push both of you further, and I'd love to understand a few specific use cases within telcos, right? So, Tony, let's start with you.
If you think about telco, they will have a lot of base stations and they'll have all the users' location. I guess anything related to location services will be top of my mind. Then we move to the next case, which is related to what Jay has mentioned, is about all these different data, different sector, which I would think risk scoring would be the second type of key services I would think about. The third services I would think about is about fraud detection. And last of all, I related to, I think, advertising related to travel. I think these will be some of the services that I think telco could actually monetize using the data.
So that's very interesting. That is such a wide spectrum. So I think you mentioned location-based services. You've talked about fraud detection. You've talked about advertising opportunity. And you also talked about cross-organizational collaboration, right? So improving credit scoring, etc. Very interesting. So let's start with the first one, location-based services. That's very interesting, and I just, as an ordinary user out there, I can think of so many examples where, depending on where I am, I do get certain alerts, certain notifications. Sometimes it's for a greater good, like we saw during the pandemic. A lot of telcos actually did a lot of good work, basis, location, ensuring that there can be cluster analysis done, etc., at that time. I also sometimes get notifications around, so sometimes not very clear whether it's telcos or someone else, but depending on where I am, and sometimes get promotions, sometimes get updates depending on where I am. So I hear you. I'm curious to know from your experience, specifically for telcos, what are some of those areas where purely from a location-based service, they could just be earning more revenue? if they had access to more data?
I guess it's the granularity of the data. As you mentioned, we do have some of these location services, but the problem is that those services may not be what I need, or those information may not be what I need. What we actually need is relevant services of high value, which is precise location related to my specific needs or specific my interests. Services, there's different levels we look at. From a government point of view, from a city planning of view, how would these additional location services help me to improve the way I run a city, plan a city in transportation, in the way that the city becomes more sustainable? How will all this pack together? And just imagine down the road when we have autonomous vehicle, even flying machines, how will all this pack together with location services? I think that will be fascinating with that. I think that's first of all. The second, location services, I think, which is relevant, particularly relevant to the Singapore economy, is tourism. We do have so much tourists. We're going to have a new airport, T5, huge amount of tourists that come in. How do we provide additional services based on their interests? They could come from different countries. They will have different interests in different parts of the city. Our recommendations will tie together, and services right from the spot when they land, the airport, customize their services based on that. I think that'll be an interesting services that we can have. And last, I think what is important is healthcare. I mean, we do have a increased population of our local peoples or Singaporeans that's above 65. Now in 2030 is probably more than 30%. How do we improve healthcare services? How do we tie down to the daily exercise, daily events? So it will be interesting that services that telcos could think about, which traditionally they are not going to this area.
So that's very interesting. I want to throw another aspect in the mix. I was reading in the news recently. There are a couple of telcos. I think there's one telco in particular which got a heavy-duty fine for illegally sharing data around location, etc. I have two questions for you. One is, how do you go and talk to a telco and unlock the technology that you're talking about, specifically MPC-based tech, to help telcos unlock more revenue? I would also love to understand from a data sharing and data movement perspective, because clearly that's something which is a key differentiator. How would you see that conversation happening, and where do you think PET can add value over here?
Right. So the case you are referring to, it's the case which happened in US. The leading telcos were fined because they actually migrated the location data of their customer to some companies, which were using location services. So to understand the use of location, monetization, and partners, we need to understand who are the partners in this use cases. Telco, and it can be advertiser, public policy like Tony was telling, or tourism industry. So essentially, we can break this whole case into a two-partner ecosystem. One partner has data, telco, and one partner is any agency which has logic, which has function to compute on that location. And they don't need exactly that long every time to track a user like GPS. Let's take an example for policy or healthcare. In policy, government might be willing to investigate how much location is concentrated in this particular geography, how many people are in this region of circumference. So the function is number of people in this circumference from this particular center. And this function can be computed through MPC without actually moving data. So telcos and these partners will use our library or our infrastructure, link up their data pipelines and logic. And once they hit enter, this computation will happen in a distributed manner, and the party will get exactly just a number of the population in that particular area, nothing else. So this privacy preserving computation can be done. Similarly, for other plannings in city or tourism planning, all they need is inference compute. And that's which I was saying before. We need to move inference, not the data, and this PET can actually perform and help in doing.
And in such use cases, just for everyone's benefit, now you're talking about two organizations. You're talking about the telco, and let's, for the lack of a better example, let's take Singapore and let's take one of the taxi aggregators out there, on-demand services. So if we were to adopt PET, would it be at the telcos end? Would it be on the on-demand service providers end? How does the implementation actually happen?
Right. It can happen both ways. The easier way is that we just convince telcos and partner with them, and then they will just expose these inference APIs. They will expose these computation outputs APIs with taxis operators like Grab, Uber, or others can just hit and get the outputs. Like the query can be numbers of taxis roaming around in this particular time at this particular location. It will go to the telco, they will compute it, and then return back the output with a guarantee that they never got full visibility of the exact location to the people. So that's the best way to do it. But if both parties partner and they join the infrastructure, then they can create much more value. That becomes much more solid down the line and easy to scale up.
So it's interesting, Jay, you mentioned cross-industry collaboration, right? Like you're talking about on-demand services and so on. So Tony, just taking it from there, when it comes to cross-industry collaboration, and you talked about, for example, credit scoring, credit rating, etc. Can you share more light on more details around that?
I think the general understanding is the more data you have is better, but also depends on the diversity of the data. In terms of credit scoring, what you actually wanted to understand is that how does it link to the different, for example, user behavior, their financial pattern, their spending pattern, their travel patterns, and a lot of time, all this data reside in multiple places. So if we able to collect, of course, it comes to data movement, as much data as we can possible, then we will have a very good scoring. And that's related to risk assessment. That means that we have a very accurate risk assessment, and that in turn, that will in place allow us to have a better loan systems and credit systems and so on. I guess this is the whole issue of how to maximize my accuracy in terms of my risk management and assessment. And that's what I really mean by risk scoring, or some function of a score. This is just one metric that I...
Makes sense. And the more I reflect on it, I do realize like a telco does understand my spending behavior, clearly understands what kind of a customer am I, what kind of spends am I doing, have I ever defaulted? So I completely see how valuable that data is. When I intuitively I'm thinking of telcos, typically one is thinking that there are a finite ways by which you can earn money or earn revenue off that. So if I hear you right, we're talking about leveraging consumers' spending patterns on telcos, whether it's for telco bills or going through their bill history, etc., and understanding more and leveraging that data. Just curious to know, are these conversations that happen within telcos?
I don't think that has been discussed a lot, because a lot of this data has been, or this type of services, it's not run by them because it touches this sensitive area of privacy and trust. And it goes back to the first discussion that we have, understanding that there are really technologies that really can protect, and you're safe from all this privacy and regulation, but yet you can monetize. But what's also important is to link back to my first mention of these location services. With location plus risk, that overall scoring will be much more accurate. And you can actually provide because a lot of times when you think about scoring, it's an average value. But you may imagine that this score will adapt or change based on where you are. I could be traveling in another place over there, and it relates to my the way I spend over there, and the scoring system could be different. So that introduced a lot of new services, but that requires also cross-sector, cross-country, and we see a lot of potential of new kind of services that can be monetized.
Very interesting. Jay, you work extensively with the BFSI sector in particular. Credit scoring is obviously at the heart of everything that happens within that industry, and it's clearly an area. There's so much of work that has been happening, but there's also a lot more that can be done. I'm curious to know, is this data relevant? Is this an important discussion that is happening right now in terms of, and how do you see that use case fitting in? To know from your experience, having worked extensively with the BFSI sector already. You have some of the biggest partners in the world that you mentioned. Curious to know that would this be of relevance, and how would one go around implementing this?
Right. Certainly of relevance. The enterprises are calling it all these primitives by the name of data enrichment. The more data sources that they have, the more richer the score will be. We have seen growing interest from alternative data sources for scoring, and banks are interested in doing that. They are not comfortable anymore in sending all or dumping all their customer data to a third party providers. And there are a couple of them. And not surprisingly, the main revenue of these scoring companies are coming from cross selling of data, and user consent has no control at all. So these also needs to be taken into account. But come to the question, yes, there is a growing interest coming up because it's not just from the company's perspective, but also there have been multiple studies by leading consulting firms in US and Europe, where they study the behavior of one customer in multiple different variables, power bills or telecom trends in spending and other sources of data and banking sectors. If you put all this together, your reliability of a score certainly increases, like Tony told. So there are certainly communications happening around. And MPC or the tech, let's say what we are building, helps to achieve that. Because the two partner example which I gave earlier now can be multi-party or multi-partner ecosystem. They all have siloed data and they want to compute this simple function of scoring. They can do it without looking at others' data point. And that will probably bring more trust in the ecosystem.
So that's very interesting, Jay. You talk about data enrichment. And Tony, I guess that brings me to one of the things that you mentioned was advertising solutions. Now, data enrichment is such a big play. It's pretty much at the heart of so many organizations. For the folks who are listening in, data enrichment is really about how companies out there can sharply target users for specific advertising campaigns. So if you're looking at a certain age group, 20-year-old, who likes to purchase a certain type of shoes, who likes to go shopping to a certain type of mall, who is located in a particular area, and I'm just connecting the dots of what we've mentioned, who is a postpaid customer, and so on. So the richer the data, the better the advertising. The better the advertising, the end user is happy, the companies that are earning revenue are happy. So it's pretty much a win-win ecosystem. There is also the development. I mean, today data clean rooms are becoming, extremely relevant with the cookie depreciation that is lined up in the coming months. Clearly, data clean rooms are becoming extremely important because it's that one place where companies are sending data and there are necessary computations happening over there to draw certain inferences. So I'm curious to know, from a telco perspective, how are you seeing this advertising to be such a big opportunity, specifically within this sector?
Okay. If you look at that, I'm going to take everyone a few steps to the future. I'm working on 5G and 6G, and one big part is to relook at infrastructure as a sensors. We're going to have sensors at the base station level that can sense very fine data. And the problem is with so much data, not just location, more than location, I understand what kind of objects they are, how close they are to my base station. Data is going to be so fine. And it gives a telco another opportunity as well as a question. With all this data, how do I monetize? And it goes back to advertisement or advertising. We look at a few opportunities. Verify segmentation, as you mentioned, segmentation according to where you are, according to the based on location, according to even your user behavior. And if you think precisely one example, you can look at travel from a point you touch down at the airport, and depending on the class, whether you're economy class, first class, or second class, and then that service can be tailored down all the way to where you are, what kind of service from the spot you leave the airport to the hotel, and you can package everything together. So this will be like a bundle services that they can look at. So I guess this is definitely one area that can look at. new behavior, because a lot of times on average, we look at um, things that we have done before, but can you predict, especially going to new places? For example, tourists come to Singapore for the first time. We may not have that data. Can you do one more step to predict based on the past behavior or data you can get from other sector, which can introduce new services? That means new services, that new opportunity you can monetize that data. I think this is missing currently, because a lot of times you look on past historical data on average data. That goes to the cross sector, because only with the richness of the data that you can find out new information.
So if I summarize, I mean, I guess we're saying that advertisers, or rather the advertising use case in telcos, becomes extremely relevant because telcos today are sitting on a lot of information at their end, which they would love to use, but they can't, purely because of regulatory compliances, etc., etc. And Jay, I guess I'm going to challenge you a bit over here, and let me put this question a bit differently to you. Today, telcos do work with data clean rooms, precisely these kind of use cases, right? They have information. They are not allowed by regulation, or for whatever reason, they're not allowed to use that information in a public domain. And therefore, they work with data clean rooms and do that. So I guess, to put it simply, why should they use this technology versus what they already have at their end working with these data clean room companies?
Right, yeah. That's a very timely question. We believe that data clean rooms are a good first step in privacy preserving and collaboration and monetization. But that's not the holy grail, and that's not the ultimate step, which we see foreseeing being used after 2 or 3 years. Why? Because of a couple of reasons. One is single point of failure, and one is consent of the user being accounted or not. Come to the first point. Data clean rooms are places where all parties bring their data for enrichment inside a confined and well protected environment, and then they will get the enriched data distributed or used on certain scripts or the functions. What is happening here is telecom or any other party is encouraged to move data from their periphery. And that's again will be a compliance issue. Not everybody will be so comfortable to do that. And even if they do it, you are trusting one company or one party, and that brings single point of failure, which we don't feel will be a long-term vision of any other enterprise. That's a good first step. Another point is, who owns the data? It's the user's data, not telecom's data. They are just mere custodians because the data is generated as I, as a user, interact with their infrastructure. So, down the line, we believe the whole user of data should have complete auditability and trackability in terms of how it's being used. I should be able to know the purpose of the user of data, not a blanket consent the way it happens right now. And that can't happen with just simple clean rooms. We need to adopt sophisticated cryptographic primitives so that consent and compute are binded. That's why I told verifiable consent for compute, which is what we are bringing to the table, wherein you can exactly link at what point in time, what consent I give, where my data is getting used, and how it's getting monetized. That transparency will come into picture. Then only user will be very happy to let their data being monetized or used for better services. Because anybody wants better service, but they do want to respect privacies and getting respected. So yeah, those are two points which we believe DCR is not a long-term.
That's extremely relevant, and I think that's clearly a differentiator. So if I understand it right, the first point that you're saying is, because PET does not involve data movement, is it fair to say that in a data clean room, whether it's telcos, whether it's financial companies, fintech organizations, I'm thinking maybe healthcare, all companies that are custodians of sensitive data, is it fair to say that a data clean room will require data movement to happen, and the PET will not require data movement to happen?
Correct, yeah. PETs like multi-party computation won't require raw movement of data. Only encrypted data are moved from point A to point B with a guarantee that not even a trusted party has authorization to do anything or overlook what's happening or what's the content.
Really, a key differentiator versus data clean rooms would be the fact that data movement actually does not need to happen, and all computation, specifically using MPC, can happen at source in a certain way. Okay, that's clearly a big differentiator. And talking about verifiable consent, can you elaborate a bit more over here? Because I'll be honest, when I speak to a few people, specifically when it comes to consent, they just put a tick and they just move on. They just select an option and they
That's a
move on.
problem, right? And that's called blanket consent in the academic domain. So what is missing right now is consent is not systematized. There's no framework to organize it. And we are working on that as part of research, where we break consent into 2 points: reactive and proactive. These all consent blanket or permission based are very reactive, and verifiable consent is proactive. What simply it means is when you give this tick consent, you will be ticking to functions or the purpose of the data use, not a blanket for any other purpose. And only that script can run on your data. And there will be good UI motivation to how to put to the user. But yeah, that's what will come up. And that's what we're working on.
So moving along, Tony, you talked about fraud. Telcos today are losing billions of dollars on account of fraud. I'm curious to know that while you're talking about this as a challenge, love to hear a few specific examples of what exactly what exactly constitutes fraud. What are some of the biggest areas of concern right now within telcos?
If you look at what we were discussing about data sharing, the more data you have a more accurate look at the metric. Fraud is the same thing. So imagine a lot of different type of frauds, whether subscription fraud, SMS fraud, and different kind of. They could use a particular telco services and they do switching. If there's no data sharing among different telcos or different services, you are not able to actually identify all this fraud, and it minimizes the risk. If you're able to share data in a secure manner and able to detect fraud without movement of data, I think that will encourage people to share data.
That's very interesting. And Jay, I guess, a quick perspective on, I almost view this as cross-industry collaboration. It's just not cross-industry, maybe it's cross companies within the same sector. What's your perspective on this?
No, right. Yeah, it binds tech and behavior. A person committing fraud in one sector won't just lose that particular behavior on day 2. So if tech like a PT can be used, we can have better tracking of the user across different telecom, like Tony is saying, and that's possible. If they can just use their silo data and they'll do compute, and the function will be very simple: track the trend of the user. And if we can expose that trend to multiple parties, this loss will be subsequently reduced. And it affects everyone. It's like a global benefit.
So if I was to summarize what you're saying, this could have so many use cases. I would imagine that you could have this cross collaboration not only across telcos, you could have it across banks, you could have it across healthcare institutions, and so on. So I think that's extremely interesting, very, very relevant. And it will be fair to say then PET actually has the capabilities of having a sectoral impact and not just across different organizations. Okay, so that's very interesting. And I'm sure we can go on and on with multiple use cases. Clearly, there is a strong value for telcos when it comes to adopting PET. But I'm going to pivot this discussion to something more realistic, right? All these examples make sense. I think it'll be fair to say that a lot of key stakeholders in the industry are broadly aware of this, right? They may not have the full awareness, as what you mentioned, Tony, earlier, but I'm sensing that they will be aware of these potential use cases and these technologies. Why are they not getting implemented, Jay?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And if we can answer it correctly, we can crack the business. So from what we see, there are 2 dominant reasons. One is regulators need to come up. Telecom companies are following the regulatory path that, okay, let them provide that this PET can solve this, then I will follow it. So regulators need to catch up on tech. The tech is moving very fast. Innovation is happening very fast. Every year you will have lots of papers and productions ready, products being built. They need to catch up. and they need to standardize a couple of things around it. They need to properly define that these bits are well defined to solve this problem, and then they will pick it up. Probably that will help to speed up the system. It's more about knowledge awareness among the involved parties, and tech, legal people, policy people, and these people do need to talk more actively through forums or through different platforms.
And Tony, curious to know, you've touched upon a few points earlier in the discussion. What should telcos, I'm going to put it a bit politically incorrectly when I say, like, what will broaden the mindset of telcos to look externally and move with how the tech industry in general is moving and start considering adopting some of these technologies? Because clearly the benefits have been laid out by both of you. What's stopping them, in your view?
I guess, to be frank, once the telco realize that the revenue decline, they need to generate new revenue. That pushes them. If not, they are sitting on a lot of data and a constant stream of revenue. They will not change. I think the mind change need to come from the top, as I mentioned. And the way a lot of organizations structure, you have the data, you have the chief data scientist or chief data officer, chief IT, chief security, and they are actually working sort of silo. And in order to do this data monetization with PET, they actually need to come together. So at the top level, they need to have a new strategy to look at long-term plan. How do we actually bring all this capability together to generate new services? Then all the new services will come. Then last is what Jay mentioned, that it involves a whole cultural change. Or a cultural change to look at really how do you monetize service, and that will change the whole telco industry, which is required for telcos to be really to survive in the next decade or more.
Well, that's hitting the nail on the head. Clearly, a mindset and a cultural change is what is the need of the hour. I think for a couple of things really stood out for me from this discussion. One was, clearly this is becoming more and more a monetization discussion. And while privacy is important, the business value really comes from the fact that this will add an incremental or a completely alternate revenue stream for telcos out there. And I really liked what you mentioned earlier, Tony, that probably that change needs to start from the top, right? And adopting these technologies becomes extremely important. One key standout for me, though, was that this is an opportunity for telcos to potentially, I guess, just earn more revenue without any data movement. And that is seriously innovative and clearly an alternate solution to everything that is being provided. Thank you again, both of you, for joining me on this. It was a super interesting conversation. We can go on for more and more on this, but I really do appreciate, and I do hope that our listeners who are listening in would find this to be extremely valuable. I think the use cases out there are plenty. This is our first episode at the Silent Podcast. We will be coming back with more in the coming weeks. Thank you again.